The railroad company's man didn't knock. He shoved the station door open so hard it cracked against the wall, and the sound sent Margaret's coffee cup skidding off the counter. He was tall, city-dressed, with a leather satchel under one arm and contempt already arranged on his face before he'd even looked at her. "You're the one running this place?" he said. Not asked, said. Margaret steadied the cup. "I am." He dropped a folded document on the counter, the way a man drops garbage. "Continental Rail gives you 30 days. After that, this building belongs to the company. You can take your broom and your coffee pot and whatever else you've got in here." He looked around the station with the slow, deliberate appraisal of someone calculating what a thing is worth once the person inside it is gone. "Though I can't imagine it amounts to much." He didn't wait for her answer. He walked back out through the door he hadn't bothered to close. Margaret stood in the silence he left behind and stared at the document. Outside, the wind was picking up off the mountains. The lantern on the windowsill flickered. She'd kept that light burning for 11 years. If this story moves you, if you've ever felt like the world decided your chapter was finished before you did, subscribe to this channel and follow Margaret's story all the way to the end. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this old train station's light can reach. The cold came early to Silver Creek Junction that year. It came in the way it always did, not with a single dramatic drop in temperature, but with a slow, grinding persistence, like something settling in for the long run. By the first week of November, the mountain passes had already swallowed their first real snowfall. The plains to the east had gone the color of old pewter, and the station, the one they'd been calling a relic for the better part of a decade, sat at the junction of both worlds, catching the wind from every direction at once. Margaret Whitmore had learned the station's sounds the way a person learns the sounds of a house they've lived in long enough. She knew which floorboard popped when the temperature dropped below freezing. She knew the particular whistle the gap above the east window made when the wind blew from the northwest. She knew the rhythm of the old stove when it was working right, and the different, more anxious rhythm it made when it wasn't. She was 58 years old, and she moved through that building like she and it had made some kind of arrangement with each other. 6 o'clock every morning, she unlocked the front doors. She swept the platform before the first light was fully up. She checked the schedule board. Even now, even when the trains that actually stopped at Silver Creek were down to 3 a week, and sometimes less if the weather pushed the delays. And she wrote the arrivals and departures in chalk, in her careful, plain handwriting. She made coffee in the big tin pot behind the counter, enough for whoever might come in, even if some mornings it was only her. There had been a time when this station moved people. Margaret remembered it, though she was careful about how much time she spent in that particular memory. Families with trunks and nervous children. Cattlemen heading east with contracts in their breast pockets. Women who smelled of perfume and wore hats with feathers, stepping off trains from places that had names that sounded like another world. There had been a lunch counter, a telegraph office, a waiting room that was actually used for waiting. Now there was Margaret and her broom, and the 3 weekly trains that didn't fully stop so much as they slowed down long enough to exchange what little there was to exchange. The townspeople of Silver Creek Junction had a range of opinions about Margaret Whitmore, and she was generally aware of all of them without having solicited any of them. The charitable ones called her dedicated. A few of the older residents, people who remembered her husband, who remembered the way this town had been, called her steady, which was the frontier's version of a compliment. The less charitable called her stubborn, a woman too attached to a past that wasn't coming back, too proud to admit the place had died around her. Some of the younger ones, the ones who'd grown up hearing about the 2 Whitmore men who hadn't survived that winter 10 years ago, looked at her with a particular soft-eyed pity that Margaret found harder to take than any insult. She did not consider herself any of those things. She considered herself someone with a job to do. The lantern was the one concession she made to sentiment. Every evening, before she locked up and walked the quarter-mile back to her rented room above the Haskell's dry goods store, she placed the lantern on the windowsill of the station's main waiting room and lit it. She had started doing this the winter after she lost them. Her husband James, her son Thomas, both taken by the fever that had ripped through the eastern settlements when the supply wagons couldn't get through. She had started it without quite deciding to, the way a person picks up a habit in the middle of grief without fully registering that it's become a ritual. And then years passed, and it was simply a thing she did, the way she swept the floor and checked the schedule board. If anyone in town thought about it, they probably assumed it was for the dead. Margaret had stopped thinking about who it was for. She just lit it. And in the morning, she came back. The last Tuesday of October was the day the man from Continental Rail came. She'd heard the company was making changes. You couldn't live in a railroad town and not hear the rumors when a company started sending its people out to assess stations. 2 towns north of Silver Creek, they'd shut the Marietta Depot down last spring. The building was still standing, Margaret had been told, but it was standing empty, just walls and a platform now, with weeds working up through the gaps in the boards. She'd heard the rumors. She simply hadn't expected the man to arrive the way he did. His name was Gerald Holt, she found out later. He was a compliance officer for Continental Rail, which as far as Margaret could tell meant he was paid to walk into places and decide that they weren't worth the trouble of maintaining. He arrived on the 8:15, which had been running 12 minutes late, and he came off that train in his city coat and his city shoes, and he walked into her station and he looked at the whole of it, the swept floor, the chalk schedule board, the coffee pot, the neat stack of repair blankets she kept for stranded travelers, and his face said exactly what he thought. Then he dropped the papers on her counter. 30 days. The language was formal and full of words like operational redundancy and infrastructure reallocation and minimum traffic thresholds, but it meant 30 days. After which, Margaret was to remove any personal property from the premises, surrender her keys, and vacate. Continental Rail would be conducting an assessment of the building's structural viability to determine future use. He was gone before she finished reading the first page. Margaret stood behind her counter for a long time after that. The coffee pot was still warm. Outside, a sparrow landed on the edge of the platform railing and then changed its mind and flew off. She folded the papers once, then twice, and put them under the counter. Then she picked up her broom and went back to work. She didn't tell anyone. Not right away. This was not a decision she made so much as a response she didn't have energy for. The kind of conversation where people would tell her they were sorry and ask what she was going to do. And she would have to stand there and figure out how to respond to a question she didn't have an answer to yet. The days moved. She swept. She made coffee. She wrote the schedule. 3 days after Holt's visit, the Thursday storm came down from the north, and it came fast and mean. By midday, the wind was enough to lean against, and by the time the 440 limped into the station, running 40 minutes late and slowing down slower than usual, the platform had an inch of snow on it, and Margaret had to hold the door against the gusts. The 440 normally didn't stop at Silver Creek Junction. It was one of the through trains, the kind that kept moving unless there was specific reason. But that evening it slowed nearly to a halt, and she heard the sharp sound of a saddlebag hitting the platform, and then the train built its speed back up and left. And when the wind shifted, she could see a man standing at the far end of the platform in a coat that was not made for this kind of weather. He was leading a horse, a big bay animal that looked as tired as the man did, which told Margaret he'd had the horse loaded in the livestock car. You didn't do that unless you were planning to ride somewhere when you got off. He stood out there for a moment, this man, and she watched through the window. He looked up the road toward town. He looked at the sky. He looked at his horse in the way a man looks at the one companion he's got left. Then he came inside. "Station's technically closed," she said, because it was almost 5 and she had been thinking about locking up. "I mean, I'm here, but officially..." The man looked at her. He had a face that had seen weather, which was not an unusual thing on the frontier, but there was something in it, a tiredness that wasn't about the journey. "The storm closed the pass," he said. "I didn't have anywhere else to be. There's a hotel in town. Quarter mile in that?" He glanced back at the door and the wall of weather beyond it. Margaret looked at the horse visible through the window, hunched and miserable on the platform. "There's a lean-to on the south side for the horses," she said. "He'll be out of the wind." "I'm grateful. I haven't said yes yet." He waited. He didn't push, didn't explain himself, didn't offer her anything. He just waited and let her decide, and that more than anything was why she said, "Stay. It's too bad out." His name was Ethan Calloway. She got that from him in pieces, the way you pull information out of someone who's spent enough time alone that talking feels like working a stiff joint. He didn't offer his last name until she asked. He didn't explain what he was doing on a westbound train with a horse in the livestock car until the second cup of coffee, and even then what he gave her wasn't exactly an explanation. "Looking for work," he said. "What kind?" "Whatever's honest." She looked at his hands around the mug. They were a working man's hands, but there was something about the way he held himself, the posture, the controlled way he moved, that suggested a history beyond simple labor. "You've done ranch work?" she asked. "Some." "Riding?" Something shifted in his expression. Slight, the way a door shifts when someone puts weight against it from the other side. "Some," he said again. Margaret refilled her own cup and let it go. It wasn't her business. She'd been on the receiving end of too many questions she didn't want to answer to make a habit of pushing. They sat in the relative warmth of the station. The stove was doing its anxious rhythm, which meant it wasn't fully happy, but it was managing. And the wind worked itself against the building, and Margaret thought about the roof on the north side, where she'd noticed 2 boards had come loose last week, and she hadn't had time to fix them. "That banging," Ethan said after a while. "I know. Boards on the north face, maybe. 2 of them. I've got the lumber. Haven't gotten up there." He looked at the ceiling like he was calculating. "Don't," Margaret said. "Don't what?" "Offer to fix it. You don't need to earn your bed." He looked at her directly for the first time since he'd come in. His eyes were a particular shade of gray that looked darker than it probably was in the poor light of the station. "I wasn't going to offer," he said. "I was going to say it needs to be done before the storm gets worse, or you'll have a leak by morning." Margaret considered this. "I was going to do it tomorrow." "In better weather?" "Yes. That's reasonable." "I know it is." The banging continued, irregular and insistent, just loud enough that ignoring it required effort. Margaret set down her cup. "The ladder's in the supply room," she said. "I'll need something to hold the boards flat while I nail them," Ethan said, already standing. "I'll hold them." He looked at her. "I'm not asking for your opinion on that," she said. "I've been up on that roof and worse. Get the ladder." They worked in the dark and the wind, which was not easy and was not pleasant. The ladder was old, and she held it from below while he went up, and then she came up after him and crouched on the cold roof and pressed her palms flat against the boards while he hammered. Her hands went numb in about 4 minutes. She didn't mention this. The wind kept trying to take her scarf. He handed her the hammer at one point to hold and reached across her to press another board flat, and said nothing, just worked, and she found she respected that. A man who talked while he was trying to concentrate on something that mattered was a man who didn't take the thing seriously enough. When they got back inside, she poured him a 3rd cup of coffee and cut him a slice of the bread she'd brought from her room that morning. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "The bread or the roof?" "Either." "The roof needed doing," she said, "and you looked like you hadn't eaten." She sat down across from him. "Have you?" He thought about it, which was its own answer. "This morning, something on the train." She cut him another slice. He ate without making a production of it, which she appreciated. Some people turned hunger into a performance. He just ate. "Where were you heading?" she asked. "Before the storm." He was quiet for a moment. "West. There's a place called Ridgeback Flats. I heard there might be work on one of the ranches." "Dunmore's place?" "Possibly." "Walt Dunmore is not an easy man to work for." She said it plainly, not as a warning exactly, more as information. "He's fair with wages, but he expects a lot, and he doesn't explain himself." "That sounds fine." "It doesn't bother you, someone telling you what to do without explaining why?" Ethan looked at his cup. "I spent a long time with people who had a lot to say about everything I did. Having someone who just wants the work done sounds pretty all right." Margaret recognized something in that. Not the specific circumstance, but the texture of it, the particular exhaustion of having been too visible for too long. She'd felt the opposite version, being invisible after years of being known. She didn't say any of that. She just nodded. The storm pushed hard against the building until well past midnight. Ethan slept in the waiting room on the bench, using his saddle blanket, and Margaret dozed in the chair behind the counter as she sometimes did on bad nights when she didn't want to make the walk back in weather. She woke twice, once to the stove clanking, once to what she thought was the sound of a horse unsettled. But when she looked out the window, The lean-to was holding and the bay was just moving around, not panicking. Morning came gray and still, the storm having exhausted itself. She was already up and had the coffee made when Ethan came through from the waiting room, rubbing the back of his neck and carrying his boots. "Sleep well?" she asked. "Better than I expected." "The bench is not comfortable." "No." She handed him a cup. He took it with both hands like he was cold, which he probably was. The station had gotten down to nearly freezing overnight, the stove having done its best, but only its best. "Storm took a tree across the tracks east of here," she said. "I heard the rail crew on the platform about an hour ago. They said the 8:15 won't be running until at least midday, maybe later." Ethan looked out the window at the platform. Then he looked up the road toward town. Then he looked back at the station. "I could check the rest of the roof," he said, "while I'm waiting." "I told you, you don't need to. I know what you told me." His voice was even, not pushing back, just precise. "I'm not doing it for you. I'll be sitting here for 6 hours. I'd rather be doing something." Margaret looked at him. He looked back. He wasn't trying to charm her, or make her feel obligated, or establish anything in particular. He was just a man who didn't know how to be idle, and was being honest about it. "The east corner needs looking at too," she said. "And there's a gap in the eave over the supply room door." "I'll start with the east corner," he said. She watched him pull on his boots, pick up his coat, and head for the door. He paused with his hand on the frame and looked back once. "The coffee's good," he said. "I know it is." He went out. She stood for a moment in the silence of the station with her own cup in her hands and listened to the sound of him moving on the platform outside, and through the walls she could hear the creak and thud of the roof being walked on by someone who knew how to walk on a roof without falling through, and she thought about the 30-day notice under her counter, still folded, still waiting for her to decide what to do with it. She thought about the empty stations further north, the weeds coming up through the platform boards. She thought about the lantern in the window, burning every night without asking whether it was still worth burning. Then she picked up her broom and started sweeping. Ethan found 3 more loose boards on the east corner and a crack in the eave over the supply room door that was wider than Margaret had thought. He didn't come back inside to report this. He just dealt with it. She could hear him up there, the careful weight of his boots, the measured hammer strikes, the occasional pause where she imagined him assessing something before committing to a fix. It was a particular kind of sound, work being done by someone who understood what they were doing, and Margaret found it harder to ignore than she expected. She had things to keep her busy. There were always things to keep her busy. She restocked the small shelf of emergency supplies she kept behind the counter: matches, a roll of bandage cloth, a tin of salve for frostbite, 2 extra candles. She updated the schedule board with the revised times the rail crew had chalked on the post outside. She went through the lost and found box, which had accumulated over the past month a wool glove with no match, a child's wooden toy horse with a broken leg, and a leather wallet that was empty but for a folded piece of paper with an address in a city she didn't recognize. She set these aside carefully, as she always did. People came back for things sometimes, even things that seemed worthless. By mid-morning, the sky had lightened to a pale, washed-out white, and the wind had dropped to something manageable. Ethan came back inside around 10, his coat carrying the cold of the roof, and he poured himself coffee without asking, which Margaret noted without objecting to. "East corner's done," he said. "Eaves patched. There's a section on the west side where the flashing's pulling away from the wall. It'll hold for now, but it'll need proper attention before the deep winter sets in." I know about the flashing. You've got the materials? I've got a list of what needs doing." She didn't mean it to come out sharp. It came out a little sharp. "I'm not blind to the state of this building." He sat down with his cup and didn't say anything for a moment. "I didn't say you were. The flashing costs money. The lumber for the roof costs money. Everything costs money, and the railroad pays me a maintenance stipend that wouldn't cover the cost of keeping a dog fed." She hadn't meant to say that either. She picked up a rag and wiped down a counter that didn't need wiping. Ethan watched her. Not in a way that felt like prying, more in the way a person watches when they're trying to understand the shape of something they've walked into. "How long has it been like this?" he asked. "The money. It's always been like this. It got worse when they cut the schedule." She put down the rag. 3 trains a week. Used to be 9. That's a significant cut. Continental Rail calls it an optimization. She said the word the way you'd say something you'd found in your boot. They have a lot of words for what things are. They're less good at explaining what things actually mean. Ethan's expression didn't change much, but something in it settled in a way she hadn't seen before. They're planning to close it, he said. It wasn't a question. Margaret looked at him. She hadn't told anyone. She hadn't said a word in 3 days, and here was this stranger who'd been on her roof for 4 hours looking at her like he'd already figured it out. What makes you say that? The way you talked about the flashing, like someone who knows the fix won't matter but is going to make it anyway. She looked away first. Outside on the platform, a thin skin of snow was still caught in the corners where the wind hadn't touched. 30 days, she said. They gave me 30 days. Silence. Then, when? 4 days ago. You haven't told anyone. I haven't decided what to tell them yet. He turned his cup in his hands, thinking. Is there someone who could contest it? A town council? A lawyer? Silver Creek Junction doesn't have a lawyer. The closest one is in Mill Haven, 40 miles east. And the town council... She stopped. Started again. The town council is 5 men who agree with each other on most things. And what they agree on right now is that this station is a liability that somebody else ought to be responsible for. And what do you think? She looked at him directly. I think I've kept this place running for 11 years without a dime of help from the town council or Continental Rail or anyone else. I think I've sheltered families stranded in storms. I've patched up a man who fell from a horse 3 miles out and would have frozen if he hadn't made it here. I've kept the only functioning telegraph in a 40-mile radius operational through 3 floods and 2 bad winters. She stopped. Her voice had gotten tight, and she didn't like that. I think this station matters whether anyone says so or not. Ethan was quiet for a moment. Then you need to make someone say so. That's easier said. Most things are. He leaned forward slightly, elbows on knees. Who knows? In town. Who would actually stand up for this place if they understood what was happening? Margaret thought about it. She thought about Ruth Calla, who ran the boarding house, and who had used this station's telegraph 4 times that Margaret knew of, once to reach a doctor in an emergency. She thought about Del Hauser, who ran the livery, and who she'd found sleeping in the waiting room one winter night when his own stove had gone out. She thought about the Beckett family, who had 7 children, and who she'd given a corner of the station to camp in for 2 days 3 years ago, when their wagon broke down and the hotel wouldn't take them without money up front. Some people, she said, then that's where you start. She wanted to tell him it wasn't that simple, that she'd lived in this town long enough to know the particular way Silver Creek closed ranks around its own comfort, that the same people she'd helped over the years were also the same people who had never once shown up to argue for her at a council meeting. She wanted to say that being right about a thing and being heard about it were entirely different problems. Instead, she said, "The 8:15 might be running by noon. You should check the platform." He looked at her for a moment, then accepted the redirect. "I'll check," he said. He stood, picked up his coat. At the door, he paused. "For what it's worth, and I understand it might not be worth much coming from someone who just got here. What you've built in this station is not nothing." He went out before she could respond, which was probably good because she didn't have a response ready. The 8:15 didn't run until 2:30 in the afternoon. Margaret knew this because the rail crew came by at noon to say the tree was bigger than they'd thought, and the east track wouldn't clear until mid-afternoon at the earliest. By that time, she had made 3 more pots of coffee, repaired a tear in a stranded salesman's coat using the kit she kept behind the counter, and argued with herself for an hour about whether to send a telegraph to the regional Continental Rail office requesting a review. She didn't send it, not yet. But she got out the telegraph ledger and started writing down what she'd want to say, which was not nothing. Ethan spent the afternoon in and around the station. He checked on his horse twice, walked the length of the platform, and at one point disappeared for about an hour. She assumed toward town, though she didn't ask. When he came back, he had a paper bag from what smelled like the bakery on Center Street, and he put it on the counter without comment. "You went to town," she said. Needed to stretch. She opened the bag. 2 rolls still warm, which meant he'd timed it. You couldn't walk to town, buy rolls, and walk back in an hour unless you moved at a pace. You didn't have to eat. I was hungry, he said flatly. There are two because I bought two. She ate the roll. It was good. The bakery was one of the things Silver Creek had that actually worked. I talked to a man in town, Ethan said after a while. He said it carefully, the way you say something you know the other person isn't going to love hearing. At the general store, I asked about the station, just generally, said I was a traveler, asked about the town. Margaret set down her roll. And? He said the station's been on borrowed time for years. Said the railroad's been wanting to close it, and the town doesn't much care either way since most people drive to Millhaven now if they're going anywhere serious. I know what people think. He said, Ethan stopped. Say it. He said the woman running it is too old and too attached to let go, and the kindest thing the railroad could do was just close it. The station was quiet for a moment. Outside, a bird called once and didn't repeat itself. That's Ed Garver, Margaret said. He's been saying variations of that for 4 years. Does it bother you? Of course it bothers me. She said it plainly, without dressing it up. Being dismissed bothers any person. I'm not made of something different. She picked up her roll again. But being bothered by something doesn't make it true. Ethan was watching her with that look again, the one she was starting to recognize. Not pity, not exactly admiration, something more like genuine attention, the way a person looks when they're trying to understand how something works. It wasn't comfortable. She wasn't used to being looked at like she was worth understanding. The man you talked to, she said. Ed Garver. His daughter missed a train 4 years ago in a storm. She was traveling alone, 18 years old. She spent the night in this station. I made her supper and she slept on the bench in the waiting room, and I walked her to the hotel in town the next morning because I didn't think she should walk alone. Margaret took a drink of coffee. He's never mentioned that when he talks about the station being past its time. Ethan was quiet. Then, some people remember help they received as something they were owed. Makes it easier not to feel grateful. I know that. Doesn't make it right. No, she agreed. It doesn't.
Awesome.
Boy. The 2:30 train came through, and it was not the 8:15. There was a complicated situation involving cars being switched and schedules reshuffled because of the storm damage. And the upshot was that the next train with any reliable connection west was not until the following morning. The rail crew delivered this news to Margaret with the slightly sheepish look of men who know they are the bearer of information nobody wants and can't do anything about it. Ethan took this news standing on the platform, his hat in his hand, looking west down the track like he was trying to see something that wasn't there. There's still the bench in the waiting room, Margaret said behind him. He turned around. He had a look on his face that she couldn't quite categorize. Not frustration, not defeat. Something that might have been relief, if she'd had to guess, though she couldn't work out why being stuck in a place would be a relief. I'll pay for the space, he said. No, you won't. Margaret. Don't Margaret me. We've known each other for less than 24 hours. She turned back toward the door. I'm making soup tonight. Whatever's in the pot, I made too much of it as usual. You might as well eat. She heard him follow her inside. The soup was a potato and dried beef situation. Nothing remarkable. Using what she had in the small supply cupboard she kept stocked against emergencies. Ethan didn't comment on it except to ask once if there was any salt, which there was, and to eat 2 bowls. They sat on opposite sides of the counter, with the stove doing its best between them and the dark fully settled outside. You said you were famous, Margaret said. She hadn't planned to say it. Or, you said you were known, in the writing circuit, before. Ethan looked up from his bowl. You didn't say that, actually, she corrected herself. I'm inferring it from the way you didn't answer when I asked about writing. A long pause. You're observant. I've had a lot of time to watch people pass through. He set his spoon down. I competed for about 8 years, riding, roping, endurance events across the territory. I was, yes, known for a while. What happened? He was quiet for a moment that stretched longer than she expected. My horse went down in a race, broken leg. I went over at speed, broke my collarbone, 3 ribs, cracked 2 vertebrae in my back. He said it the way someone describes a weather event, factually, without self-pity, but with the particular flatness of someone who has decided not to feel anything about a thing that actually cost them everything. I healed, more or less, but the kind of riding I did, competition riding, it requires a certain confidence in your own body. After the fall, I could ride. I just couldn't ride like that, not consistently. I'm sorry. It was 3 years ago. 3 years isn't that long. He looked at her. No, he said after a moment. It's not. They sat in the quiet for a while. The stove popped. The lantern on the windowsill burned low, and Margaret got up and trimmed the wick without thinking about it, a mechanical motion she'd made 10,000 times. Why do you light it? Ethan asked. She stood at the window with the wick trimmer in her hand and looked at the lantern. Habit, she said. Which was true, but not the whole truth. He didn't push for the rest of it. She appreciated that. What she didn't expect was what happened next. She turned back from the window and found him holding the folded Continental Rail notice that she'd left under the counter. She'd forgotten she'd left it there. He wasn't reading it. He was just holding it, looking at her, and there was a directness in his expression that she wasn't accustomed to from people who were essentially still strangers. I'm sorry, he said. I was looking for the salt and I picked it up without thinking. She took it from him and put it back under the counter. Now you know. 30 days from 4 days ago. 26 days, she said, if you want to be precise. He sat back. I do want to be precise about it, actually. He looked at her steadily. Are you going to fight it? I'm thinking about it. That's not the same as yes. I'm aware. He leaned forward. What would it take? To fight it? What's the actual mechanism? Is there an appeal process? Continental Rail has a regional review board. You can submit a formal objection with supporting documentation, evidence of community use, operational value, safety necessity. They're not obligated to respond, but they're obligated to log the objection before proceeding. She said it in a clipped, factual way that told him she'd already looked this up. I've read the company charter. Something shifted in his expression. You've already looked into it. I said I was thinking about it. I think thoroughly. A small, actual smile crossed his face. It changed his whole expression, made him look younger, less worn. She hadn't seen him smile before, and she found it briefly disorienting in the way that unexpected things can be disorienting. What do you need for the documentation? He asked. Records of every person this station has sheltered, every emergency it's responded to, every function it performs that the town can't replicate. She paused. I have records going back 9 years. I've kept a station log every single day, every traveler, every incident, every supply dispensed, every telegraph sent. He stared at her. I said I was thorough, she said. You have 9 years of daily logs. I'm going to be honest with you, she said. Part of why I kept them was because I knew this day would probably come eventually. I just didn't know when. Ethan looked at the folded notice under the counter, then back at her. Then you have the documentation. I have the documentation. I don't have the argument. Or the presence. The kind of presence that makes a review board actually listen. She said this without embarrassment because she'd learned long ago that there was no utility in pretending she didn't understand what she was up against. An older woman maintaining a station nobody thinks matters isn't the kind of voice that carries far in a company boardroom. No, he said quietly, but other voices might. She looked at him. He was looking back at her with an expression she couldn't completely read, and she realized he was working something out, turning something over in his mind. She'd seen that look on people before, the look of someone deciding how much of a thing to commit to. The storm broke around the east track, he said slowly, like he was working through it as he spoke. Rail crew said the line should be clear by 6 tomorrow morning. Train west departs at 8. He paused. That's 8 hours. I'm aware of the schedule, she said. I wrote it on the board. He ignored that. 8 hours is enough time to start going through your logs, to identify the strongest documentation, the incidents that would be hardest for a review board to dismiss. Margaret looked at him. This man she'd known for slightly less than 1 full day. This man who had nowhere to be and was going somewhere anyway, first thing in the morning. Why would you spend your evening doing that? He picked up his coffee cup. Because the soup was good, he said, and because... He stopped, set the cup down. Because I've spent the last 3 years letting things I should have fought for just happen. And watching someone else do the same thing doesn't sit right with me. The station was quiet around them. The lantern burned on the sill. Margaret reached under the counter, not for the notice, past it to the shelf below where she kept the logs. 11 volumes, plain covered, her handwriting filling every page. She set the first 2 on the counter between them. The worst storm season was 4 years ago, she said. Start there. He pulled the first log toward him and opened it. They worked until well past midnight, and the train west left the next morning at 8, and Ethan Calloway was not on it. He missed the 8 o'clock train, and neither of them talked about it directly. Margaret came in at 6, as she always did, and Ethan was already awake, sitting at the counter with the log spread in front of him and a piece of paper where he'd been writing things down in a small, precise handwriting that surprised her. She'd half expected something rougher from a man with his hands. He had a list of 17 incidents from the 4-year storm season alone. Dates, names where she'd recorded them, circumstances. The kind of list that told a story without editorializing. The 8 o'clock board's at 7:40, she said. I know. She started the coffee. Neither of them said anything more about it. At 7:45, she heard the westbound come in, slow, pause, and pull away. She didn't look at him. He didn't offer an explanation. He turned a page in the log from 2 winters back and kept writing. What she felt about that, she kept to herself. By the end of the first week, Ethan had made himself into something she didn't have a clean category for. He wasn't a boarder. She wasn't charging him, and he wasn't asking for accommodation in any formal sense. He wasn't an employee. She had no authority to hire anyone, and Continental Rail certainly wasn't going to authorize a wage. He was something more like a presence that had taken up residence alongside her own, and the station, which had been quiet for so long that the quiet had become its own kind of sound, adjusted around him the way a room adjusts to furniture rearranged. He fixed the flashing on the west side. She hadn't asked. She came in one morning and he was up there with the materials from her supply room, and when he came down, he reported that there was also a section of gutter pulling away from the north eave, and he'd secured it with what he had, but it would need a proper bracket before spring. She wrote it in her maintenance log. He went and washed his hands. The documentation work continued in the evenings. Margaret had kept her logs in plain language. What happened, when, who was involved, what she did. And Ethan was systematically extracting the incidents with the most demonstrable community impact. A family of 6 stranded for 3 days during the flood of '89. No road access. The station the only shelter between them and 40 miles of bad weather. A mining survey crew that used the telegraph to call in a medical emergency when one of their men took a bad fall a mile west of the junction. The time the westbound train struck an elk at the ridge approach and the injured passengers were brought back to the station, and she'd managed 9 people with varying degrees of shock and minor injuries for 6 hours before the company sent assistance. You should have been reimbursed for that, Ethan said, the night they went through the incident. I submitted a request. And Continental Rail sent me a form letter thanking me for my dedication to passenger welfare. He looked at her. That's what they sent. That's what they sent. He wrote it down on his list. Not the form letter, the incident. But his jaw had a particular set to it that she recognized as controlled irritation, and she found she didn't mind it. Someone being angry on her behalf was not something she'd had much experience with. The town, meanwhile, was beginning to register that something was happening. Silver Creek Junction was not a large place. Maybe 400 people when the seasonal workers were around, closer to 300 in deep winter, and a stranger spending 2 weeks at the station was the kind of thing people noticed and discussed. Ethan didn't go out of his way to introduce himself, but he wasn't unfriendly either. He went into town for supplies. He spoke to people when they spoke to him. He was polite without being ingratiating, which Margaret suspected was about as much as anyone could say about him. Ruth Calla came by the station on a Wednesday of the second week. Ruth ran the boarding house on 2nd Street and was one of the few people in Silver Creek who had known Margaret long enough to ask direct questions without preamble. That the cowboy they're talking about? Ruth said, nodding toward the platform where Ethan was stacking lumber he'd brought from town. His name is Ethan Calloway. I know his name. Del Hauser told me. Del said he knew a Calloway who rode circuit about 3-4 years ago. Won the territorial endurance 3 times running. Margaret poured her a coffee without being asked. Did he? Ruth sat down on the stool across the counter, pulled the cup toward her, and looked at Margaret with the particular expression she used when she was about to say something Margaret wasn't going to like. You should have told me about the notice, she said. Margaret had told her the week before, when she'd finally accepted that keeping it to herself wasn't a strategy, it was just postponement. I told you when I was ready. You told me when he'd already been here 10 days. He doesn't have anything to do with when I told you. Ruth looked through the window at Ethan on the platform. He's going to help you fight it. He's helping me organize the documentation. Margaret. Ruth. They looked at each other. Ruth Calla had a way of communicating volumes without raising her voice. She'd run a boarding house for 20 years and had developed a specific expertise in the gap between what people said and what they meant. I'm just asking if you know what you're doing, she said. I'm trying to keep my station. That's not what I'm asking about. Margaret picked up her cloth and wiped down the counter. The coffee's fresh. Take it or leave it. Ruth took it. She stayed for 40 minutes, and when she left, she paused at the door and said, without looking back, if you're putting together signatures from people who've used this station, I've used this station. Put my name on something. Margaret wrote her name down before she'd even turned back from the door. The list grew. It grew slowly and not without friction, because some people in Silver Creek had made up their minds about the station long before the notice arrived, and some of those people were not going to unmake their minds just because a cowboy was stacking lumber on the platform. Ed Garver didn't sign. 3 of the 5 town council members declined, 1 of them politely, and 2 of them not. A rancher named Pulliam, who'd had some kind of property dispute with the railroad years back, signed immediately and with what seemed like personal satisfaction that went beyond any concern about the station itself. But there were enough others. The Beckett family, all 7 children now listed in Margaret's records. The foreman from the mining operation west of the ridge, who happened to be in town and who remembered the telegraph call for the injured surveyor. Del Hauser, who had been sleeping in the waiting room that winter night when his stove went out, and who signed without Margaret even having to remind him. Old Mrs. Farrow, who had lived in Silver Creek for 40 years and who made the point, in a thin but firm voice, that this station was the only reason her daughter had been able to get out of this town in 1883 when she needed to go and had 23 cents to her name, and Margaret had let her wait free of charge. Margaret hadn't known that was the reason Mrs. Farrow had always brought her a tin of her preserves every September. She'd thought it was just what the old woman did. 26 signatures. It wasn't nothing. The formal objection document was typed by Elsa Prentice at the telegraph office, who charged $2 for the service and did an extraordinarily clean job. It ran to 11 pages, including the incident summary Ethan had compiled from the logs, the signature list, and a map Margaret had drawn herself showing the distance to the nearest alternative shelter on both sides of the junction, with travel times marked for foot, horse, and wagon. Ethan had suggested the map. They respond to visual evidence, he said. It's harder to dismiss something you can see the shape of. You know a lot about how review boards think, Margaret said. I sat in front of enough of them after the accident. He said it without bitterness, just fact. Insurance people, competition committees, the association that sanctioned the races. They all want the same thing, something that makes the decision feel obvious. You give them obvious. She'd looked at him then, this man who'd spent 3 years learning how institutions worked by being on the wrong end of them, and she'd thought about what that kind of education cost. Did any of them rule in your favor? The insurance paid out, eventually. He picked up his pen. Let's talk about the map scale. The objection package was sent via telegraph to the Continental Rail Regional Office in Carson City on a Thursday afternoon, 18 days after Holt had dropped his notice on her counter. Margaret sent it herself, standing at Elsa's key, and she felt the send the way you feel the moment after you've committed to something. Not relief exactly, more like the specific absence of the weight of postponement. She walked back to the station, and Ethan was there with coffee already poured, and he didn't say anything celebratory or encouraging, which she appreciated. He just handed her the cup and asked if she was hungry. Not particularly, she said. I'm going to make something anyway. He made a reasonable attempt at cornbread on the station stove, which was not designed for baking and made the whole operation an exercise in improvisation. The first batch burned on the bottom. He ate it anyway, standing at the stove, cutting the burned part off and eating what was left with the same matter-of-fact approach he brought to most things. The second batch was better. 4 days later, Gerald Holt came back. He arrived on the midday train. Same leather satchel, same city coat, same expression of a man who considered his time too valuable for whatever room he'd been sent to. He walked in, looked around, registered Ethan with a brief, calculating look, and turned to Margaret. "We received your objection," he said. "I gathered, since you're here. The regional office asked me to conduct an in-person supplementary assessment before the review board convenes." He opened his satchel and produced a form. "I'll need access to your maintenance records, your incident logs, and a full inspection of the physical structure." "You'll have them," Margaret said. Holt's eyes moved to Ethan again. "And this is?" "Ethan Calloway," Ethan said. He didn't stand, didn't extend his hand, didn't offer any further information. He just said his name and let it sit there. Something flickered in Holt's face. Not recognition exactly, more the sensation of a name landing somewhere close to something familiar. "Calloway," he said. "That's right." Holt looked at the logs stacked neatly on the counter, the typed incident list, the map tacked to the wall behind Margaret's station. His expression shifted. Not softened, that wasn't the word, but recalibrated. He was reassessing what he'd walked into. "I'll start with the physical inspection," he said. "I'll walk with you," Margaret said. She came around the counter and picked up her own copy of the maintenance log. "I've kept a record of every repair made, the date it was done, and the materials used. I'll answer any questions while we go." She walked Holt through the entire building, the waiting room, the supply room, the telegraph station, the platform, the lean-to. She answered every question without flinching, including the ones designed to catch inconsistencies and the ones that were simply rude. At one point, he looked at the patched east corner of the roof and asked who had done the repair work, and she said she had, with assistance, and she pointed to the entry in the maintenance log with the date and the materials. Holt wrote things on his form. Ethan stayed inside during the inspection. Margaret hadn't asked him to. He'd made the choice himself, which was the right one. His presence out there would have read as a challenge, and a challenge was not what this moment called for. This moment called for Margaret walking Holt through her building with 11 years of meticulous records under her arm, making it impossible to say this place wasn't cared for. When the inspection was done, they stood back in the main room. Holt capped his pen. He looked at Margaret with an expression she couldn't entirely classify. "The documentation you submitted is more thorough than we typically receive in a case like this," he said. "I'm thorough." "The review board meets in Carson City on the 15th. They'll consider the objection and the supplementary assessment." He put the form back in his satchel. "I'll be honest with you, Mrs. Whitmore. The board's primary concern is traffic volume. 3 trains a week is below the threshold for a maintained station." "The threshold is a company policy," Margaret said. "It's not a physical law. It can be revisited." "That's not—" "If the board would consider reinstating even one additional weekly stop," she said, "the traffic numbers would reflect differently in the assessment. The infrastructure is here. The capability is here. I've demonstrated that the community need is here." She held his gaze. "I'm not asking you to give me anything Continental Rail hasn't already got. I'm asking you to use what's already in place." Holt looked at her for a long moment. "I'll note your statement in my report," he said. "I'd appreciate that." He left on the 4 o'clock. Margaret stood on the platform and watched the train diminish down the track, and the cold came in off the mountains the way it always did at that hour, cutting and direct. She was tired in a way that had nothing to do with the work, the particular tired that comes from holding yourself together under someone's inspection for 2 hours without letting the seams show. Ethan came out and stood beside her, not close, just nearby. "You did well," he said. "I don't know what I did." "You made it impossible for him to say you hadn't tried. That matters with review boards. They're looking for a reason to deny that doesn't make them look like they're kicking an old woman out of a building she's kept running for 11 years. You've made that reason hard to find. That's not the same as winning." "No," he said. "It's not." They stood there for a while. The train was long gone. "He recognized your name," she said. "I know." "Is that good or bad?" Ethan thought about it. "Depends on what he remembers." He put his hands in his coat pockets. There's a man I know, knew, Arthur Reeves. He was on the territorial writing circuit, covered it for a newspaper out of Carson City. He wrote about me a fair amount over the years. He still works there, last I heard. He was looking down the track, not at her. If someone wrote about this station, about the objection, about what's actually at stake, a regional paper story might carry some weight before the board meets. Margaret looked at him. You'd contact him? Someone from your circuit days? He was quiet for a moment. I'd have to explain why I'm here, what I've been doing. Another pause. Arthur's a decent man. He'd want to write about the right thing. I think this is the right thing. That's not what I asked. He looked at her then. I know it's not. He took a breath through his nose. Yes, I'll contact him, if you want me to. She thought about what it cost a man who'd spent 3 years running from his own name to pick it back up and hand it to someone. She thought about what it meant to make yourself visible again for something other than yourself. Write the letter tonight, she said. I'll have Elsa send it tomorrow morning. He nodded once. The letter went out the next morning. The response came back in 4 days. Arthur Reeves was interested, was in fact very interested, was planning to be in the Western Territory the following week for another story, and could he stop at Silver Creek Junction and speak with Mrs. Whitmore directly? Margaret wrote back, yes. She was behind the counter sorting through the latest stack of mail when the door opened on a Tuesday morning and a man she'd never seen came in. Broad-shouldered, 50s, with a reporter's notebook already in his hand and the look of someone who'd walked into a lot of places where he wasn't fully expected and had made his peace with it. He stopped when he saw Ethan. They looked at each other. Ethan. The man's voice carried something. Not quite surprise, something more complicated. You look... Arthur. Ethan stood up from the bench where he'd been working. Thanks for coming. I almost didn't believe it was you when I got the letter. Arthur Reeves looked at him for a moment longer than the greeting required. 3 years? About that. You could have written before. I know. A silence settled between them that had weight to it. Old history, the kind that doesn't go away but can be stepped around carefully when two people have enough sense to do it. Then Arthur turned to Margaret and extended his hand. Mrs. Whitmore, Arthur Reeves, Carson City Territorial Dispatch. I understand you've built something worth saving here. Margaret shook his hand. I've kept something running, she said. There's a difference, but yes. Arthur Reeves stayed 2 days. He went through the logs with the same careful attention Ethan had, asked questions that told Margaret he understood what he was reading, talked to Ruth Calla and Del Hauser and Mrs. Farrow, walked the full length of the platform in the cold and stood at the map on the station wall and traced the distances with his finger. He was professional about it in a way that didn't feel cold, which was a harder balance to strike than most people understood. On the second evening, he sat across the counter from Margaret with his notebook closed and his coffee going cold, and he asked, Why this place? Of everywhere you could have gone after you lost your family, why a train station in a town that's been trying to forget it exists? Margaret considered the question. She'd been asked versions of it before, and she'd always given versions of the same deflecting answer. She looked at the lantern on the windowsill. Because people pass through here, she said. That's what a station is. People in between one place and another, going towards something or coming back from something or trying to figure out which one they're doing. She paused. I understood that. After James and Thomas died, I was between. I didn't know the name of the place I was going, and the place I'd been was gone. A station made sense. Arthur wrote nothing. He was just listening. And then I just stayed, she said. People needed the place, so I stayed. Arthur looked at Ethan briefly, then back at Margaret. He said, That's the story. He filed his piece from Elsa's telegraph office the night before he left. It ran in the Carson City Territorial Dispatch 6 days before the review board meeting, front page below the fold, with the headline, Forgotten. Junction. The widow who kept the light burning and the railroad that wants to turn it off. Margaret read it at the counter on a cold morning, alone before Ethan was up, and she made it through the first 3 paragraphs before she had to stop and look out the window for a while. It wasn't that the piece said anything wrong. It was that someone had looked at what she'd been doing for 11 years and had written it down as if it mattered, and she hadn't realized until that moment how much she'd needed someone to do that. She was still sitting there when Ethan came through from the waiting room. He stopped when he saw her face. "The piece ran," he said. "Yes." He poured himself coffee and sat down across from her and didn't ask her to explain what she was feeling. He just sat there, and the station was quiet around them, and outside the mountains were the color of iron in the early light. The review board meeting was in 11 days. 3 days before it, the letter arrived from Continental Rail's regional office. Margaret opened it, standing at the counter. She read it twice before she set it down. Ethan watched her face. Good news or bad news? She smoothed the letter flat on the counter. "The review board has agreed to a hearing," she said, "in person. They want to hear testimony before they rule." "That's different from what Holt said." "Yes," she said. "It is." She looked at him. He looked at her. Neither of them said what they were both thinking. That this wasn't over, that a hearing was not a victory, that the board could hear everything she had and still rule against her. That 26 signatures and 11 pages of documentation and a newspaper story and all of Ethan Calloway's careful work through her logs might still not be enough. "Carson City," he said. "When?" "The 15th, that's 10 days. He nodded slowly. "We'll need a stronger verbal argument than the written one, something they can't set aside." He was thinking out loud, she could tell, the same way he'd worked through the documentation, methodically, without wasted motion. "Your incident records are solid, but the board needs to understand what happens the day this station closes. Specifically, what the gap looks like. I've mapped the distances. I know, but I want them to hear it from someone who's driven that stretch in winter, someone who knows what 40 miles of bad road means." He looked at her. "Is there anyone in town who'd testify? At the hearing?" Margaret thought about it. Del Hauser has driven every road in a 40-mile radius for 30 years. Would he go to Carson City? If I asked him. Ask him. She asked him that afternoon. Del Hauser was 63 years old and had the legs of a man who spent his life either in a saddle or under a wagon, and the reluctance of someone who'd spent 40 years avoiding anything that resembled a formal proceeding. He said no twice, and yes once, in that order, and Margaret accepted the yes before he could change his mind. There was one more thing, and it was the thing she'd been working around for days, circling without landing, because it required asking something she didn't know how to ask. She waited until that evening, when they were both at the counter with the logs put away and the day's work done and the lantern burning on the sill. She waited until the moment felt right, which it never quite did, and then she stopped waiting and just said it. "The hearing," she said. "They'll listen differently if you're there. If you speak." She didn't dress it up. "Your name means something to the region. Arthur's piece mentioned you. People will have read it. The board will know who you are. And you know how to talk to official bodies in a way that I don't have that particular skill." Ethan looked at his cup. "I know what I'm asking," she said. "I know what it costs you to be visible again. I know you came here to disappear and not to—" She stopped. "I know." The silence stretched. Outside, the wind had picked up and was working at the north face of the building, the face they'd fixed together in the dark on the night he arrived. It held. "Carson City's 3 days by rail from here," he said finally. "Yes. We'd need to leave a week before, to prepare. The station can go unstaffed for a week. The trains will still run." He was quiet for a long time, long enough that she started to think she'd read it wrong, that she'd assumed too much about what this place had become to him. "There's something you need to know," he said. "Before we go." He set his cup down. "I said I left the circuit because of the fall. That's true, but it's not all of it." He didn't look at her. "After the fall, when I was healing, I made some bad choices. I had a manager, a man named Cord, who had invested significant money in my career and who wasn't finished with that investment just because I was hurt. He wanted me back on circuit before I was ready. I refused. He stopped. There was a dispute, a public one. It got into the papers. I said things. He said things. Some of what I said was wrong, and I knew it when I said it. And I said it anyway because I was angry and scared and I wanted to hurt something." He looked at her now. "Arthur knows the whole story. The board might too. Anyone who followed the circuit news from 3 years ago." Margaret looked at him steadily. What do you want me to say to that? I want you to know it, before you decide if you want me in that room. She considered it. She considered what it meant to carry the damage of a choice made in a bad season. She considered all the things she'd said and done in the years after James and Thomas, the months when grief had made her into a version of herself she wasn't proud of, the things she'd never fully accounted for because there was no one left to account to. I know you now, she said. I don't know who you were when you were scared and angry. Neither does the review board. She picked up her cup. If it comes up, we'll deal with it. Are you coming to Carson City? He looked at her for a moment. Something in his face had shifted. Some long-held tension, like a rope that's been pulled too tight for too long, finally allowed to go to its natural state. Yes, he said. Margaret nodded and picked up the letter from the review board and started making a list of what they'd need to prepare. They left for Carson City on a Monday, 6 days before the hearing. Delhauser came to the station at 5 in the morning with a clean shirt folded under his arm and the look of a man who had agreed to something and was now experiencing the full weight of that agreement. He shook Ethan's hand without being introduced, which meant word had fully circulated in Silver Creek by that point, and he sat down on the bench in the waiting room and accepted coffee and didn't say much. Del was a man who communicated primarily through presence, and his presence that morning said, I'm here. I said I'd be here. Let's get this done. Margaret locked the station doors for the first time in 11 years. She stood on the platform with the key in her hand after the lock clicked, and she felt the particular wrongness of it. The building sealed behind her, no light in the window, the chalkboard inside still showing the current week's schedule in her handwriting. She'd asked Ruth Calla to check the building twice a day and to flag anything that needed attention. Ruth had said yes without making her ask twice, which was the kind of friend Ruth was. She put the key in her coat pocket and picked up her bag and didn't look back at the building again. The train to Carson City took most of the day with one change at the Millhaven Junction. They sat in a passenger car that was warm enough to be comfortable and cold enough to remind you the heat wasn't guaranteed, and Del slept for most of the first stretch with his hat over his face, which Margaret found oddly comforting. Ethan sat across from her with the testimony notes spread on his knees, reading through them, making occasional marks in the margins with a short pencil he kept behind his ear. She watched the landscape move past the window. They were heading east and then south, away from the mountains, into flatter country where the sky went wider and the light had a different quality, more open, less constrained. She'd made this journey before, years ago with James, going to see his sister in Millhaven. The train had been different then, or maybe it was just that everything looked different when you had someone sitting next to you who you expected to be there. You're going quiet on me, Ethan said, without looking up from his notes. I'm thinking. About the hearing? About other things. He looked up then. Do you want to talk through it, the testimony structure? We still have time to... Not about the hearing, she said. He put the notes down on his knee. Waited. James and I made this trip once, she said. A long time ago. She looked out the window. I keep catching myself thinking he'd have something to say about all of this. He had opinions about railroads. He thought the companies had gotten too big, that they'd stopped thinking about the people and started thinking about the track. A pause. He wasn't wrong. Ethan was quiet, not filling the silence, just holding it, which was something she'd noticed about him. He didn't feel the need to cover quiet with noise. Thomas would have been 31 this year, she said. If the fever hadn't... She stopped. She hadn't meant to say that. It came out before she could decide about it. I'm sorry, that's not... Don't apologize, he said. She looked at him. His expression was steady and serious, and there was no discomfort in it, no reaching for the exit that most people found when she mentioned her son. Just attention. 31, he said. What was he like? When he was young? Nobody had asked her that in years. She thought about it honestly. Stubborn, she said, like his father, but louder about it. He wanted everything explained to him before he'd try it. Drove James half crazy. She found herself almost smiling, which surprised her. He was afraid of horses until he was 9, and then he wasn't afraid of anything. No middle ground. Just decided one day he was done being scared, and that was it. Smart kid. He was. She looked back out the window. I don't talk about them much. People get uncomfortable. I noticed. You don't. Everybody's lost somebody, he said simply. I don't know why we act like it's something that shouldn't be said out loud. Dell snored once under his hat and resettled himself without waking up. Margaret looked at her hands in her lap. What about you? Do you have— No? He said it without heaviness, just fact. My parents are gone. No brothers or sisters. I had a— He stopped, started again. There was a woman, a few years before the accident. We were together for 2 years. After the fall, when everything started going bad, she left. I don't hold it against her. I wasn't easy to be around. Were you two— We were going to get married. He said it flat and level. She gave the ring back in a letter. She didn't even do it in person. A pause. I understood it. I still think about the letter sometimes. The train rocked gently on the tracks. Outside, a cluster of buildings went by. Too small to be a town, just a cluster. And then disappeared back into open land. The letter, Margaret said carefully. Was it— It was honest, he said. That's the part that stuck. She didn't make excuses. She said she couldn't watch someone choose to be in pain when they didn't have to be. He turned the pencil in his fingers. She was right. I was doing that, choosing it somehow. Easier to be miserable than to figure out what came next. And now? He looked at her. The light in the car was the particular flat gold of late afternoon. I'm figuring out what comes next, he said. They arrived in Carson City in the early evening and found the boarding house Arthur Reeves had recommended. A clean, plain place 2 streets from the rail office, with a proprietor who asked no unnecessary questions and whose prices were reasonable. Margaret took a room on the 2nd floor. Ethan's room was down the hall. Dell was across from him, and Margaret could hear Dell's boots hit the floor one at a time and then nothing, which meant he'd gone to sleep immediately, which was a useful talent. Arthur met them for supper. He'd been in Carson City all week covering a separate story and had the look of a man who'd eaten too many meals at the same desk. He ordered the most substantial thing on the menu without appearing to read the rest of it and asked how the journey had been. Fine, Ethan said. Dell sleep the whole way? Most of it. Arthur looked at Margaret. How are you holding up? I'm here, she said, which was the truest answer. He told them what he knew about the review board. There were 5 members. The chairman was a man named Harrison Price, company background, 15 years with Continental Rail before moving to the regional board, the kind of appointment that happened when someone was too political to fire and too senior to ignore. Price's instinct would be to follow company precedent, which was against them. The 2 members to the right of Price were career company people as well. The 2 on the left were civic appointees, one a former town mayor, one a retired territorial judge. And those 2 were the ones who might actually weigh the evidence. 3-2 against you before you walk in, Ethan said. Possibly, Arthur said. Price is also image conscious. He doesn't like bad press. The piece ran well. We got letters. He looked at Ethan. Your name was mentioned in 3 of them. People remember the circuit years. Ethan looked at his plate. That can go either way. I know. We're going to get ahead of it. Arthur leaned forward slightly. I want you to address it directly in your testimony. The fall, the recovery, why you're in Silver Creek. Don't wait for them to bring it up. Arthur, I know what I'm asking, but the narrative that's dangerous is the one where you're a disgraced rider showing up to meddle in something that's not your business. The narrative that helps is the man who came looking for a quiet place to start over and found something worth fighting for. Those are both true. We just need to tell the second one first. Ethan was quiet for a long moment. You always did know how to frame a thing. It's what you paid me for. I didn't pay you. I know. That's why I still like you. There was something between them, the specific warmth of 2 people who'd been through something together years ago and hadn't lost the thread entirely. Margaret watched it and felt it as separate from her, not in a lonely way, more in the way you observe something true between 2 people and are glad it exists. The days before the hearing were a particular kind of exhausting. They went through the testimony 3 times in the boarding house parlor. Margaret's account of the station operations, Dell's account of the road conditions and distances, Ethan's prepared statement. They argued about word choices. Dell objected to one version of his testimony on the grounds that it made him sound, in his words, like a man who'd gone soft, and they revised it. Margaret cut 2 paragraphs from her own account that she decided were defensive in tone rather than factual, and was glad she'd cut them. Ethan rewrote his opening 3 times, and on the third version said nothing to either of them for 20 minutes afterward, sitting very still in the chair by the window. She didn't ask what he was thinking. She knew he was deciding how much of himself to put into that room. The night before the hearing, she couldn't sleep. She lay in the boarding house bed listening to Carson City's particular nighttime sounds. Different from Silver Creek, more of them, the city's noise persisting later into the night. And she thought about the station locked and dark with no lantern in the window. She'd asked Ruth to put a lantern in the window while she was gone. She didn't know if Ruth had remembered. She thought about James. She thought about what he'd say if he could see her here, in a city boarding house bed, fighting a railroad company with a cowboy's help and a liveryman's testimony. He'd probably say she was being stubborn in the most expensive way possible. He'd say it with the particular smile he'd had when she proved him wrong, anticipating the outcome before the argument was over. She fell asleep somewhere after 2 in the morning and woke at 5 and got up and dressed in the dark. The Continental Rail Regional Office was a solid brick building that communicated institutional permanence through its architecture, columns, wide steps, the company seal above the door. They arrived 20 minutes early. The lobby had the temperature of a place that is heated adequately but not warmly, which Margaret suspected was intentional. Harrison Price ran the hearing the way a man runs a meeting he's already decided the outcome of and is conducting out of obligation. He was in his 60s, silver-haired, with a manner that stopped just short of dismissive without ever quite crossing the line into actual rudeness. He introduced the board members, explained the procedure, noted that the board had reviewed the submitted documentation and would now hear testimony, and looked down at his papers in a way that said his mind was already elsewhere. The civic appointee on the left, the former mayor, a broad-faced man named Clyde Oster, looked at the documentation with genuine attention. The retired judge, a woman named Clara Bowen, who said nothing during the introductions and watched the room like she was reading it, picked up the incident summary from Ethan's compiled list and read it while Price was still explaining the procedure. Margaret went first. She had rehearsed this. She had rehearsed it until she could say it in her sleep, and still, standing in front of 5 people in a formal hearing room with the company seal on the wall behind them, her mouth went dry at the first sentence. She drank from the water glass in front of her, which gave her 3 seconds to recover, and then she began. She did not make it dramatic. She had decided that drama was the wrong approach, that Price would use drama as a reason to dismiss her. She was factual. She walked them through the station's operational history, the services provided, the incidents documented. She cited dates and numbers without looking at her notes more than twice. She was careful and precise, and she kept her voice level even when she talked about the family stranded during the flood, and even when she talked about the injured surveyor, and even when she talked about Ed Garver's daughter, 18 years old and alone, spending the night on the bench in her waiting room. When she was done, Price asked 2 questions that were designed, she felt, to establish that the incidents were exceptional rather than regular, and therefore insufficient grounds for maintaining a fully staffed station. The incidents you've described are emergencies, he said. Emergencies by definition are irregular. Emergencies are irregular, Margaret agreed. The potential for them is constant. That's the point of the station. She looked at him steadily. You don't close a fire station because there was no fire last Tuesday. Clyde Oster wrote something on his notepad. Clara Bowen, who had not spoken since the proceedings began, said, Mrs. Whitmore, in 11 years, have you ever turned anyone away from this station? No, Margaret said, even when the official operating hours were past. No. Why not? Margaret thought about the most honest answer. Because I live a quarter mile from the building, she said, and I know what's 40 miles in either direction. Clara Bowen nodded once and made a note. Dell went next. He was uncomfortable in the formal room, which was visible in the way he sat and in the way he held his hat in his hands throughout the entire testimony, turning the brim in a slow rotation. But when Oster asked him about the road conditions on the eastern stretch in winter, Dell Hauser became a different kind of speaker. Direct, specific, layered with 30 years of practical knowledge that no amount of company policy could replicate. He described the Eastern Road in February without a maintained shelter at the junction in terms that were vivid without being theatrical. He named distances in hours on horseback, in days on foot, in the particular mathematics of what it meant to be a family in a broken wagon on that road in a storm with children and no fixed point of refuge. Price tried twice to redirect Dell into shorter answers. Dell ignored him both times, not belligerently, simply in the way a man ignores interruption when he's in the middle of saying something true. When Dell sat down, he put his hat back on, then remembered he was indoors and took it off again, and the small human awkwardness of it landed in the room as more persuasive than anything scripted could have been. Then Ethan stood up. He stood rather than sitting at the table, which Margaret hadn't expected. He was wearing his better coat, and he'd shaved that morning, and he held himself with the kind of stillness that comes from a long time spent in front of crowds, and having learned what to do with your hands and your weight when people are watching you. He started with his name. He didn't add anything to it, just let it sit. He saw Price's recognition. A flicker, there and gone. Clara Bowen looked up from her notes. Clyde Oster's pen paused. I came to Silver Creek Junction 6 weeks ago on a train I hadn't planned to take, Ethan said. I was heading somewhere else. A storm changed that, and I got off. He spoke without notes. I want to be direct about who I am and why I'm here, because I suspect you've all read Arthur Reeves's piece, and you know about the accident and what came after it, and I'd rather say it plainly than have it said around me. He paused. 3 years ago, I was a competitive rider with a reputation and a career, and I made choices in the aftermath of losing both that I'm not proud of. I said things in public that I shouldn't have said. I had reasons, and the reasons were real, and they were still not good enough. He looked at the board, at each of them in turn. I'm not here to ask you to think well of me. I'm here because what Margaret Whitmore has built in that station is real, and because I've spent 6 weeks watching a woman of 58 years run a building that 2 men half her age would struggle to maintain, keep records that any city office should envy, and serve this region's travelers with a consistency that I have not seen matched anywhere I've been in this territory. Price shifted in his seat. I've seen the distances on the map, Ethan continued. I've helped repair the roof in a November storm. I've gone through 9 years of daily logs, and I can tell you that on average, this station has provided shelter, supplies, telegraph service, or direct assistance to a traveler in distress 14 times per month. Not 14 times a year. Per month. He let that sit. That's a service Continental Rail's providing through Margaret Whitmore's labor for a stipend that I understand amounts to less than the cost of maintaining the building's supplies. If you close this station, you are not removing an operational redundancy. You are removing the region's most cost-effective safety net and calling it optimization. He stopped. He wasn't done. She could tell he wasn't done. And the room was waiting in the way rooms wait when they know more is coming. I had a career that I lost, he said. I know what it feels like to have a review board decide you're past the useful point. I know what it feels like to have people who've never stood where you've stood decide they understand what you are and what you're worth. His voice stayed even. This was the part that cost him. She could hear it. Margaret Whitmore has never asked anyone for that kind of assessment. She just kept doing the work for 11 years, without recognition and without assistance and without complaint. He looked at Price directly. The question in front of this board is whether Continental Rail's obligation to the region it operates in includes the people who live and travel in it. I think you know the answer to that. I'm asking you to say it out loud. He sat down. The room was quiet for a moment that lasted longer than most quiet moments. Clara Bowen was the first to speak. Mr. Calloway, the documentation indicates the station's telegraph is the only functioning unit within 40 miles. Is that correct? That's correct. And Mrs. Whitmore operates it independently. The company provides no telegraph technician. She's been the telegraph operator since she took the position, Ethan said. She is also the maintenance staff, the scheduling officer, and the emergency services coordinator. One person. Bowen made a note. Thank you. The board went into closed deliberation at 11:30. Margaret, Ethan, and Dell sat in the hallway on a wooden bench and waited. Dell put his hat on his knee and looked at the opposite wall. Ethan leaned forward with his elbows on his knees. Margaret held her copy of the incident summary in her lap without reading it. You did well, she said to Ethan after a while. He shook his head slightly. I said what I needed to say. That's the same thing. Maybe, Dell said without looking away from the opposite wall. I thought the one who kept writing things down was going to be useful. Clara Bowen, Margaret said. She had the look of someone who'd already made up her mind, just wanted the record to reflect it. He rolled his hat brim once. My sister has that look. She's usually right. They waited an hour and 20 minutes. When the hearing room doors opened and they filed back in, Price looked like a man who had lost an argument he hadn't expected to lose. Clara Bowen's expression gave nothing. Clyde Oster had put his notepad away. Price spoke first, which was his role, and his voice had the particular flatness of someone delivering a result they don't personally endorse. The board had voted 3-2 in favor of retaining Silver Creek Junction Station with full operational status. Additionally, the board recommended that the Regional Operations Committee review the current staffing stipend against Regional Safety Service standards. Additionally, the board was recommending restoration of a 4th weekly train stop pending infrastructure review. Margaret heard the words. She heard them one at a time, the way you hear things when you're afraid to process them too quickly in case you've heard them wrong. She did not make a sound. She was aware of Dell exhaling next to her, a slow and controlled breath that was the closest he would come to showing relief. She was aware of Ethan very still beside her. Price finished. He looked up from his paper at Margaret with an expression that was not quite gracious and not quite cold, somewhere in between, the expression of a man who respects a result even when he didn't vote for it. Mrs. Whitmore, he said, the board acknowledges your 11 years of service. Thank you, she said. Her voice was steady. She was concentrating on making it steady. They walked out of the building and into the cold Carson City afternoon, the 3 of them, and Dell immediately put his hat on and said he was going to find something to eat and that the boarding house supper wasn't until 6, and he wasn't going to wait until 6. And he went off down the street, and that was Dell. Margaret stood on the top step. The city was going about its business around her. Wagons, people, the sound of another train somewhere south of them pulling out of a yard. Ethan stood beside her. She didn't say anything for a long time. There wasn't the right word available yet for what the last hour had been. She had fought for something, and the fight had come out the way she'd needed it to, and that should have felt simple, and it didn't feel simple at all. It felt enormous and quiet at the same time, like the first morning after a long winter. 3-2, she said finally. 3-2, he said. Bowen voted for us. And Oster. And one of the company people. Apparently, he paused. Price wasn't happy about it. No. Another pause. She looked at the street below them. Somewhere behind all the relief was something else moving, something she hadn't fully named yet. The station was saved. She was going home, and Ethan Calloway was standing next to her on a step in Carson City with nowhere he was supposed to be, no train to catch, no obligation pulling him anywhere. She thought about that. She thought about what it meant, or what she was afraid it meant, or what she was afraid to want it to mean. We should find Dell before he eats himself into a stupor, she said. Ethan made a small sound that was close to a laugh. Probably. She went down the steps, and he came with her, and the afternoon was cold and bright, and the street went on in both directions toward whatever came next. The train back to Silver Creek left the following morning. Dell slept again almost immediately. Margaret and Ethan sat across from each other as they had on the way out, and the landscape reversed itself past the window. The open plains closing in, the mountains growing back on the horizon, the sky taking on the particular character of home country. She had the incident summary on her lap. She wasn't reading it. She was looking at the mountains. When we get back, she said, there'll be things to do. The 4th stop means we need to update the schedule, adjust the supply ordering, probably look at the waiting room capacity. Margaret, she looked at him. The mountains aren't going anywhere, he said, and neither am I. She looked at him for a moment, then back at the window. The train moved through the landscape, taking them home. Silver Creek Junction looked exactly the same when they got back, which was somehow both a relief and a mild shock, the way a place always looks the same when you've been gone through something significant and half expected the world to have rearranged itself to match what happened inside you. Ruth Calla had kept the lantern burning. Margaret saw it before the train fully stopped, the small, warm point of light in the station window, visible even in the gray afternoon, and something in her chest loosened in a way she hadn't been aware was tight. She'd asked Ruth to do it and hadn't known until that moment how much she'd needed it done. Dell was off the train before it finished slowing, moving with the efficiency of a man who had fulfilled an obligation and was now returning to his own life without ceremony. He shook Ethan's hand on the platform, nodded at Margaret, said, "Good result," in the tone of someone issuing a verdict rather than a compliment, and walked toward town without looking back. That was Dell. She'd known him 20 years, and it was one of his most reliable qualities. Ruth was waiting inside. She had apparently also made coffee and put a plate of something covered with a cloth on the counter, which was so thoroughly Ruth that Margaret nearly said something she'd have been embarrassed about. Instead, she set her bag down and stood in the middle of her station and looked at the chalkboard, schedules still in her handwriting from a week ago, and the supply shelf and the worn floor and the stove that was ticking its particular anxious tick, and she thought, still here. 3-2, Ruth said. She'd clearly been briefed. Dell probably, or Ethan had telegraphed ahead. 3-2, Margaret confirmed. Ruth looked at her for a moment with the particular expression of someone who wants to say something large and is refraining. Then she said, "I kept the lantern going." "I saw." "Every night. I also swept the platform twice because we got wind on Thursday." "Thank you, Ruth." Ruth looked at Ethan with the same frank assessment she'd given him on her first visit, the one that said she was deciding what category to put him in and hadn't finished yet. "You did good," she said. Not warmly, not coldly, factually. "Mrs. Whitmore did the work," he said. "I know that. I'm saying you helped." Ruth picked up her coat from the stool where she'd left it. "There's chicken under that cloth. Don't let it get cold." She paused at the door. "The town knows about the result. Oster's daughter is married to a man who trades in Carson City. It was around Silver Creek by last night." She left. The door settled closed. Margaret stood for a moment in the station's quiet, listening to it. The building had a particular silence when it was closed up, held somehow, like a breath being kept. She walked to the window and looked at the lantern Ruth had put there. It wasn't her lantern. Ruth must have brought one from the boarding house. But the flame was the same size and quality, burning steady in the draft-free space of the windowsill. She heard Ethan come up beside her. "You should eat," he said. "In a minute." They stood there for a moment, both looking at the lantern. The light was the same kind of light it always was, but small, practical, doing what fire does. And it didn't mean anything that could be put into clean language. It just burned. "When I started lighting it," she said, "the first winter after James and Thomas, I told myself it was so I could find my way back. The station in the dark is hard to see from the road." She paused. That was true, but it wasn't the reason. She looked at the flame. "I lit it because I was afraid that if I stopped doing things that were specific to them, they'd go further away than they already were." Ethan said nothing. "I know that's not how it works," she said. "I know they don't go further, but grief has its own logic, and it doesn't ask your opinion." She was quiet for a moment. "After a while, it just became the thing I did. The station needed a light in the window anyway. It stopped being about keeping them close and started being about keeping the door open for whoever needed it." "That's not a small thing," Ethan said. "No." She touched the edge of the lantern frame lightly. "It's not." The next morning, she unlocked the station at 6, as she always had, and wrote the schedule on the chalkboard and made coffee in the big tin pot. And the first train through was the 8:15, which was running 3 minutes early for once in its operational life. And 2 passengers got off with luggage and asked about routes east, and Margaret answered their questions and helped a woman whose trunk latch had come loose, and the day picked up its rhythm, and she was in it. Ethan was there. He'd taken to staying at the boarding house on 2nd Street, a real room, paying actual rent, which he'd arranged with the Haskells the week after he missed the westbound. And he arrived most mornings around 7 after she'd already opened up, and he found things to do. There were always things to do. The 4th weekly stop was approved within the month. Continental Rail sent the official confirmation in a letter that was considerably more formal than the occasion required, signed by someone Margaret had never interacted with, and she put it in the station records file and updated the chalkboard. The stipend review came back in February. It was increased by 30%, which was still not enough but was something. Enough to order proper materials for the west side flashing repair, enough to replace the stove, which was reaching the end of its reliable life, and enough to stock the emergency supplies to the level Margaret had always thought they should be stocked, rather than the level she'd been managing on. Ethan bought the new stove. Margaret didn't find this out until it arrived on the freight car, and Del Hauser showed up with 2 men from his livery to help move it in, and she turned to Ethan and said, "You didn't have to." "The old one was going to fail in the next bad storm," he said. "You know I'm right." "That doesn't mean you—" "Do you want the stove or not?" She looked at the stove, which was a solid, well-made unit that would heat the station properly for 20 years. She looked at Ethan, who was already directing Del's men on the angle of approach through the door. She picked up her coffee and stepped out of the way. "Careful on the threshold," she said. The stove went in without incident, except for one moment where Del's man Perkins got his foot caught and said something that made Margaret look at the ceiling briefly, and then it was in, and Ethan got it going while Del's men were still catching their breath, and within an hour the station was warmer than it had been in 11 years. Winter came in hard that year and stayed hard. 3 separate storms closed the passes and backed up train schedules by days at a time, and the station was full in the way it used to be. Families with nowhere to go, men caught between towns, once a young woman alone with a baby who had been trying to reach her sister in Millhaven and couldn't, and Margaret made up a corner of the supply room and fed her and the baby for 2 days until the roads cleared. Ethan fixed a fence section that had blown down in the first storm and patched a gap in the supply room wall that the second storm found, and generally moved through the disaster season with the same methodical competence he brought to everything. And Margaret watched him do it and thought about what Ruth had said in October. The question she'd asked that Margaret had deflected, about knowing what she was doing. She still wasn't sure she knew, but she was less afraid of not knowing. Ed Garver came into the station in January. This surprised her. He came in on a Tuesday morning when Ethan was in town getting supplies, and it was just Margaret behind the counter, and he stood in the doorway for a moment as if he hadn't been sure until the last second he was going to come in. He was a man in his mid-60s with a rancher's build and a face that expressed its emotions reluctantly, and he stood there and looked at her and then came to the counter. "Coffee?" she said. "Please." She poured it. He stood with the cup and didn't say anything for a moment, which she let him have. "I heard about the hearing," he said eventually. "Most people did." "I heard what you put together, the documentation, the signatures." 26 of them, she said. He turned the cup in his hands. "I wasn't one of them." "No, you weren't." He looked up. "My daughter," he said. "Clara. She told me last fall when all this started, that you kept her here the night of the storm." He stopped. "She'd never told me the details. I knew she'd been delayed. I didn't know—" He stopped again. "She was 18, traveling alone." "She was," Margaret said. "She was fine. She was capable. She just needed a place to be for one night." Garver was quiet. "She told me you made her eat something, that she didn't want to take food she hadn't paid for, and you told her that wasn't how the station worked." "I don't remember what I said. I probably said something like that." He looked at the counter. "I've said some things about this station, about you." "I know what you've said, Ed. I'm not going to—" He started and stopped. "I'm not good at this." "I know that too." He looked at her directly. His face was doing the reluctant thing, working through something it hadn't been designed to express easily. "You took care of my daughter," he said, "and I said you were past your time." He set his cup down. That wasn't right. Margaret looked at him for a long moment. This man who had made her life harder without probably fully understanding that he was doing it, who had talked about her in front of others in a way that had seeped into the town's general assessment of what she was worth. She thought about what it cost him to be standing here. Not much, maybe, compared to what it had cost her, but not nothing either. "The coffee's included," she said. "You can have a second cup." He looked at her, then he looked at the cup. "Thank you," he said. He didn't become a supporter in any obvious or vocal way. He wasn't built for that, but he stopped talking, which was its own kind of change, and sometimes that's the most that's available from a particular person, and it has to be enough. February moved into March, and the storms finally began losing conviction. The mountain passes started clearing. The fourth weekly train ran for the first time on a Wednesday in early March, and Margaret wrote the time on the chalkboard in letters slightly larger than necessary, which was the closest she came to celebrating. That evening, Ethan came in after she'd already locked up. She let him in. She'd given him a key by then, an arrangement neither of them had formally discussed, but that had happened the way several things between them had happened, through accumulated practical sense rather than deliberate decision. He came in with the look of a man who had been thinking about something all day and had arrived at the end of the thinking. She was doing the station log. She didn't look up. "Whatever it is, say it." He sat down across the counter. "I got a letter today." She looked up then. "From a man named Bauer," he said. "Frank Bauer. He runs an event circuit in New Mexico territory. Endurance events, some roping competitions. He read Arthur's piece and then did some digging and tracked me down." He put the letter on the counter between them. "He's offering me a position, not as a rider, but my back won't hold a competition pace anymore, and we both know that. As a training coordinator, working with young riders coming up the circuit." Margaret looked at the letter. She did not pick it up. "It's good money," Ethan said. "It's real money, more than I'd make doing repair work for the next 5 years combined." "When would you need to decide?" "He wants an answer by the end of the month." She looked at him. He was watching her carefully, and she recognized the look. The same look he'd had on the platform that first evening, when he'd stood in the cold assessing a situation before committing to a direction. He was reading the room, reading her. She was not going to make this easy for him in the wrong direction. That wasn't what either of them needed. "New Mexico is a long way," she said. "Yes." "Is it what you want?" He was quiet. 6 months ago, I would have said yes immediately, without thinking about it. It was exactly the kind of thing I thought I was looking for. A way back into the world I knew, without having to be who I was in it. He turned the letter on the counter. "I'm not sure that's still what I'm looking for." "Ethan, I'm not being—" "I know you're not." She folded her hands on the counter. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer it honestly." "All right. If this station weren't here, if I weren't here, would you take the position?" He looked at her steadily. "Probably," he said. "Yes." She nodded. "Then you should think very carefully about whether you're staying for the right reasons." "I know my reasons." "Tell me one of them." He leaned forward slightly. "Because I've spent 3 years learning what it looks like when I'm somewhere I don't belong. And I know what that feels like in my chest and in my sleep and in the way the days move. And none of that is how this feels." He looked at her directly. "Silver Creek feels like the first place in 3 years where I've woken up in the morning and not spent the first 10 minutes trying to remember why I'm there." She held his gaze for a moment. "That's the station," she said carefully. "That might not be—" "It's not just the station, Margaret." His voice was patient and precise. "I think you know that." The station was very quiet. The new stove was doing its work without the old one's anxiety, just steady, consistent heat. And outside, the March wind was making its case against the building in the usual way, and the building was holding in the usual way. She thought about what Ruth had been trying to ask her since October. She thought about the train journey, Ethan across from her in the car with his notes, the way he'd asked about Thomas. She thought about what it meant to be 58 years old and to have spent 11 years believing that the part of her life that held another person in it was behind her, sealed off like a room you don't go into because the going in costs too much. She thought about what it costs to keep a room sealed over time, the energy of it, the maintenance of the closure. "I'm not easy," she said. "I know. I don't explain myself well. I make decisions without consulting people and then expect them to catch up. I've noticed. I have 11 years of habits that don't make room for—" She paused. "For someone else's preferences. I have 3 years of bad ones," he said. "We can work with that." She looked at him. He looked back. There was nothing performed in his expression, no charm, no effort toward persuasion, just a man being precise about what he wanted and letting her have the time to decide. Right back to Bauer, she said. Thank him. Tell him you've taken a position. Ethan went very still. There's no salary in it, she said. The stipend won't cover a wage for 2 people. But the 4th stop means more traffic, and if we can argue the case to Continental Rail for a proper station contract, there might be something in 6 months. Margaret, the West Side needs a full structural assessment before next winter, and I want to expand the telegraph operating hours, but I can't do that and maintain the platform both. And she stopped. She was listing practical things. She knew she was listing practical things because the practical things were easier to say than the other things. She stopped listing them. I'm saying yes, she said. If that wasn't clear. He let out a breath. It was a quiet breath, controlled, but she heard what was in it. It was clear, he said. She picked up her pen and went back to the station log. He stayed at the counter. After a while, he got up and poured himself coffee, then poured a second cup and set it beside her without being asked. And she wrote the day's entry in her careful, plain handwriting, and the stove did its steady work. And outside Silver Creek Junction was settling into evening the way it always did. That was March. What came after was not simple, because nothing worth having is simple once you get past the deciding of it and into the daily fact of it. The first 2 months were an education for both of them in what it actually meant to share a space and a rhythm with another person. Ethan had habits she found irritating. He left cabinet doors open, which she'd never understood how a grown person could do and not notice. And he had a way of rearranging things he was working with and not returning them to their original position. She told him both of these things directly, which was the only way she knew how to address anything. And he listened and improved on one of them and never fully fixed the other, which was honest. She had habits he found harder to manage. She made decisions inside her head and presented them as conclusions, which left him feeling like a person who'd come in after a meeting that had already happened. She did this with the supply order in April, and they had their first real argument, which was messy and uncomfortable and said some things that needed to be revisited the next morning and were. They were not naturally easy with each other in the way people in stories sometimes are, where understanding arrives smoothly and misunderstandings resolve in one conversation. Their understanding came in pieces, over time, at the cost of actual effort, which was the only way it was going to mean anything. Ruth Calla, who watched this process with the interest of someone who had seen many versions of it over 20 years of running a boarding house, said to Margaret in May, "You two argue like people who intend to keep arguing. That's actually a good sign." How is that a good sign? Because people who don't intend to stay stop arguing. They go quiet instead. Ruth picked up her coffee. Quiet's what you should worry about. Margaret thought about that. She thought about the years of quiet she'd had, the particular quality of silence in a building where no one is coming and you've stopped expecting them. She thought about what it cost and what you don't know it's costing until the cost ends. Arthur Reeves came back through Silver Creek in June on his way to cover a story further west. He spent an evening at the station and ate supper with them at the counter and talked about his work with the comfortable ease of someone who had a life he'd built deliberately rather than inherited accidentally. He and Ethan talked about the circuit years without strain, not like men who'd fully resolved a complicated history, but like men who'd agreed on which parts of it to carry and which to set down. Margaret listened to this and understood that healing between people rarely looks like a scene. It mostly looks like 2 people choosing the same direction on an ordinary evening. Before Arthur left, he pulled Ethan aside on the platform. Margaret could see them through the window but couldn't hear, and they talked for about 10 minutes. When Ethan came back in, he was quiet, in the way he was quiet when he'd been given something to think about. She didn't ask. He'd tell her when he'd processed it, which was how he worked and which she'd learned to not take as exclusion. He told her that night. They were closing up, she was checking the log, and he was banking the stove. And he said, "Arthur wants to write a longer piece, about the station, about the hearing and the outcome. He thinks there's a story in what happens when one person decides to document something carefully enough that nobody can pretend it didn't happen." She looked up. "What did you say?" "I said I'd ask you." She thought about it. She thought about her name in a newspaper, her logs quoted, her station described in terms that would be read by strangers. She thought about the years of invisibility and what she'd felt when Arthur's first piece ran, the particular disorientation of being seen. What kind of story would it be? She said. The kind where the station stays open, he said. The kind where the documentation mattered. It did matter. I know, that's the story. She looked at the log in front of her. 9 years before she'd started, she'd made the decision to write everything down, not because she knew a review board would someday need to see it, but because she believed that what happened in this building on any given day was worth recording. She'd believed that in the absence of anyone telling her it mattered, she would maintain the record herself. That had been a kind of stubbornness. It had also been, she understood now, a kind of faith, not in any particular outcome, but in the value of the thing itself. Tell him yes, she said. Ethan nodded. The piece ran in August, 5 months after the hearing. It ran longer than the first one, with the incident statistics and the board result, and a section about the value of private documentation in disputes with institutional power. Margaret read it at the counter on a Tuesday morning and didn't stop when she reached the parts about herself, which she'd been afraid she would. She read the whole thing straight through. Near the end, Arthur had written about what a train station is, at its simplest, a place between places, where people are neither where they came from nor where they're going. He wrote about what it means to have someone tend such a place, not as a job, but as a kind of commitment. He wrote that the person who keeps a light in a window at a junction that most maps have stopped marking is doing something that resists the economic logic that says a thing is only worth keeping if it turns a profit. He didn't name her in that paragraph. She was glad. She folded the paper and put it under the counter, next to the spot where the 30-day notice had once lived. That notice was long gone. She'd burned it in the stove in March, a small and private ceremony that she hadn't announced to anyone, not even Ethan. Some things only need a witness from inside. Summer moved through Silver Creek Junction with the particular insistence of frontier summers, dry and direct and bright in a way that made the shadows sharp. The fourth weekly train had settled into the schedule like it had always been there. Traffic was up. Margaret updated the waiting room, which meant she bought 2 new benches from the carpenter on 3rd Street and had Ethan repaint the walls a cleaner color, an operation that resulted in paint in his hair and a conversation about technique that got heated in a way that ended with her laughing, which she hadn't expected. She didn't laugh easily. She was aware of that. But it was happening more often, and she was aware of that too. In September, Mrs. Farrow brought her preserves as she always did. But this year she brought 2 tins, and when Margaret asked about the second one, Mrs. Farrow looked at Ethan at the other end of the counter with the expression of someone who has made a quiet decision. The young man fixed my fence post in July, Mrs. Farrow said. He didn't tell you? He didn't. He said it needed doing, and he was passing, and he did it. She set the tins firmly on the counter. People who do things without needing to be thanked for it deserve preserves. She left. Ethan, who had heard all of this, kept his eyes on the rail schedule he was reading and said nothing. But the set of his shoulders had something in it, not pride exactly, more the specific quality of a person who has found out they've been seen doing something they did without an audience, and who discovers they're glad the audience exists. Margaret put his tin of preserves next to the stove where she kept hers. October came around again, the air going cold and familiar. A year. She hadn't marked the anniversary in any formal way, and it wasn't a clean anniversary in any case. He'd arrived on a particular Thursday in a storm, and nothing had been decided on a particular day. It had all accumulated the way real things accumulate, in layers and increments without clean edges. The evening of the first Thursday of November, near enough to the anniversary that it counted, she and Ethan were at the counter after the last train had gone through, the station locked, the coffee made for the last time that day. He was reading, she was writing in the log. She wrote the date and the temperature and the train arrivals. And the one incident worth noting, a couple with a young boy who had gotten turned around east of the junction and come in for directions, the boy wide-eyed at the chalkboard and the telegraph key and asking questions until his parents apologized and she said, "Don't apologize, let him ask." She let him ring the bell on the counter. She showed him how the telegraph key worked, just the mechanical motion of it, the way it clicked. He was probably 7 years old, and he touched that key like it was the most serious piece of machinery he'd ever been trusted near, and she thought about Thomas at 9 deciding he was done being afraid of horses. And it didn't hurt the way it used to. It still hurt, just not the same way. She wrote it all down. Then she closed the log and looked up and found Ethan watching her. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said, "just looking." She held his gaze for a moment. Something had changed between them over the year. Not dramatically, not in the way of revelation, but in the way of something that had been foreign becoming familiar. His face was familiar to her now. His quiet and his noise and his specific competence and his specific failings. The way he held a cup and the way he looked at a roof before he climbed it. The way he'd looked in that hearing room when he'd stood up and said his name without adding anything to it, just letting it be what it was. She picked up the lantern. "I'm going to light it," she said. He stood and came around the counter and held the door of the lantern while she touched the match to the wick, and they set it together on the windowsill, and the flame caught and held in the still air. She had been lighting that lantern for 12 years now. For the first 10, it had been one of the loneliest acts of her day. Now Ethan was standing beside her, and the flame was the same flame, and the window was the same window, and the mountains outside were the same mountains going dark in the evening air. She didn't believe the light reached James or Thomas. She'd stopped believing that a long time ago. But she believed it was visible from the road, and that people moving between one place and another in the dark could see it and know there was a stop here, that someone was tending this place, that the door would open. That was what she believed. And it was enough. "Ready?" Ethan said. She picked up her coat. "Yes," she said. They walked out into the cold together, and she locked the door behind her, and the lantern burned on in the window of Silver Creek Junction Station. Not because the dark required it, and not only for the people who might need it, but because some things, once you've committed to keeping them, simply become part of what you are. And Margaret Whitmore, 59 years old and more alive than she'd given herself permission to be in a very long time, was not in the habit of letting the light go out.